Whispers at midnight. The glass dome of the Wellington Botanical Gardens glittered like a jewel against the night sky. Evelyn Reed adjusted her simple black dress, feeling distinctly out of place among the wealthy patrons of the annual Botanical Preservation Gala. She wasn't supposed to be here at least not as a guest. But when the photographer failed to appear and the event coordinator had a panic attack, Evelyn's background in botanical photography and her secret talent for organization thrust her into an unexpected spotlight. "You've single-handedly saved this entire evening," Mrs. Harrington, the foundation's chairwoman, squeezed Evelyn's hand. "No one would ever guess you weren't planning this for months." Evelyn smiled modestly. "Plants are more predictable than people. They just need the right conditions to thrive." She scanned the room, mentally checking that the lighting highlighted the rare orchid. Displays she'd repositioned to create intimate conversation nooks throughout the space. "Well, you've created quite the perfect ecosystem tonight," Mrs. Harrington nodded toward the crowd. "Even Julian Blackwood seems almost social." Evelyn followed her gaze to a tall figure standing apart from the mingling guests. Even in isolation, he commanded attention not through any obvious effort, but through the quiet intensity that seemed to radiate from him. Julian Blackwood, founder of Nexus Innovations, was notorious for his brilliant mind and his equally remarkable absence from public life. "He never attends these things," Mrs. Harrington whispered. "His company donated the interactive conservation exhibit, but we never expected him to appear in person." As if sensing their attention, Julian turned. His eyes met Evelyn's across the room, and something unexpected passed between them: recognition, perhaps, though they'd never met. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began departing, Evelyn slipped away to the moonlit conservatory to photograph the night-blooming cereus that was the centerpiece of the Foundation's preservation efforts. Through her lens, she captured the delicate white petals unfurling in the moonlight. "Blooms for just one night," a deep voice observed from behind her. Evelyn turned to find Julian Blackwood standing in the doorway, his formal attire at odds with the wild botanical surroundings. "That's what makes it special," she replied, lowering her camera. "Some things aren't meant to last. And yet you're preserving it," he noted, stepping closer, "capturing something ephemeral and making it permanent." Evelyn smiled. "Not permanent. Just ... echoed. "A reminder that beauty exists even when we can't see it anymore." "You speak like someone who understands impermanence," Julian said, studying her with curiosity. "I've moved 27 times in 30 years, she admitted. "I've learned to appreciate moments rather than monuments." For reasons she couldn't explain, Evelyn found herself walking with Julian through the moonlit gardens, sharing thoughts she rarely voiced aloud. He listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard. "Most people at these events are performing," Julian said as they paused by a reflecting pool. "You're the first person I've met who seems authentically present." "Maybe because I don't belong here," Evelyn laughed softly. "I'm just the emergency replacement." "No," Julian said with unexpected conviction. "You're exactly where you should be." The night deepened around them as they talked about everything from conservation genetics to philosophy, from childhood dreams to adult disappointments. When Julian's hand brushed hers, Evelyn felt a current of possibility she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Under a canopy of stars visible through the glass ceiling, Julian's expression grew serious. "I'd like to see you again, Evelyn." She hesitated, knowing all the reasons she should walk away. Tomorrow, she would be leaving the city, returning to a life Julian Blackwood couldn't possibly understand. But tonight, in this impossible moment, she allowed herself to believe in serendipity. "Some moments," she whispered as she leaned closer, "are meant to live once, but echo forever." When their lips met, Evelyn knew she would remember this night long after she disappeared. Vanished Bloom Julian Blackwood couldn't remember the last time he had felt so disoriented. For a man who built his empire on precision and foresight, being unable to locate one woman was both humbling and maddening. 3 weeks had passed since the Wellington Botanical Gardens Gala, and Evelyn Reed had vanished as completely as morning dew under a summer sun. "I've exhausted every resource, sir," his personal assistant Dominic reported with uncharacteristic defeat. The event company says she was a last-minute replacement, paid in cash. The phone number she provided goes to a disconnected line. She has no social media presence that we can find. The address on her temporary contractor paperwork leads to a short-term rental that was vacated the morning after the gala. Julian paced the length of his minimalist office, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city skyline he normally found so centering. Today, it only reminded him of how vast and anonymous urban life could be, how easy it was for someone to disappear if they truly wanted to. "What about the photography portfolio she mentioned?" Julian asked, recalling how passionately Evelyn had spoken about her work documenting endangered botanical species. Nothing published under the name Evelyn Reed in any major conservation journals or botanical publications. Dominic replied, "Either she uses a pseudonym, or she wasn't." Being truthful, Julian finished, though the suggestion didn't ring true. Everything about their conversation had felt genuine. It was what had drawn him to her in the first place. That refreshing authenticity in a world of calculated interactions. Julian dismissed Dominic and sank into his chair, reaching into his desk drawer for the only tangible evidence that Evelyn Reed hadn't been a figment of his imagination: a pressed wildflower, rare blue gentian with a handwritten note tucked inside a small envelope. He had discovered it in his jacket pocket the morning after the gala. The note read simply, "Beauty persists in hidden places. Thank you for a night of rare honesty." No contact information. No explanation for her abrupt departure. Just a preserved bloom and cryptic words that haunted him through sleepless nights. Meanwhile, the coastal town of Port Arbor, 300 miles from the city. Evelyn Reed parked her weathered pickup truck outside a quaint Victorian house that had seen better days. The sign hanging from the wraparound porch read Reed's Nursery and Botanical Photography in faded green letters. Beneath it, freshly painted, under new management. "Grandpa, I'm back!" she called, carrying grocery bags through the front door that served as both home entrance and shop counter. The rich scent of soil and growing things enveloped her, a perfume more precious to her than any. Designer fragrance. Harold Reed sat in his wheelchair by the bay window, surrounded by potted ferns and orchids that created a miniature jungle around him. At 83, his body had betrayed him, but his mind remained sharp as the pruning shears he could no longer grip properly. "Any customers today?" Evelyn asked, unpacking fresh vegetables and the medications that had become a substantial part of their monthly budget. 2 locals for seedlings. 1 tourist for a portrait with the butterfly garden. Harold's observant eyes narrowed. "You look tired, Evie? Still not sleeping?" Evelyn avoided his gaze, just adjusting to small-town rhythms again. "It's quieter here." Harold replied, unconvinced. "And does this adjustment have anything to do with why you suddenly abandoned your city apartment? And that museum job you loved to come take care of your old grandfather and a failing family business?" "The business isn't failing," Evelyn countered, ignoring the first part of his question. "Not anymore. My photography sales are picking up online, and the nursery specialization in native endangered species is drawing interest from conservation groups." Harold reached for her hand as she passed. "Evelyn Teresa Reed, you can't outrun your father's mistakes forever." She stiffened. "I'm not outrunning anything. I'm exactly where I need to be." But later that night, as she developed photographs, in the makeshift darkroom that had once been a pantry, Evelyn allowed herself to remember Julian's intense gaze, the unexpected warmth of his hand against hers, the way he had listened, truly listened to her thoughts about preservation and impermanence. In her 29 years of keeping people at a careful distance, no one had ever broken through her defenses so effortlessly. She hung a new print to Dre, a night blooming Sirius captured in perfect detail, its ephemeral beauty preserved. Beside she pinned the front page of a financial newspaper she'd been unable to throw away. Julian Blackwood's profile occupied a small photo in the corner, accompanying an article about his company's revolutionary conservation technology initiative. "Some connections are better left as beautiful memories," she whispered to herself, trying to ignore the hollow ache in her chest stand, the nagging fear that the scandal surrounding her father would eventually reach even this quiet corner of The world outside her window, the coastal fog rolled in, obscuring the edges of everything, much like the boundaries between past and present, between what was and what might have been. Paper trails. Julian stared out the window of his private jet as it descended toward the small regional airport serving Port Arbor and several other coastal communities. The business trip had been arranged hastily after a promising marine conservation technology startup caught the attention of his investment team. Normally, he would have sent representatives rather than attending personally. But something about the coastal town's name had triggered an inexplicable feeling intuition. Perhaps, or desperate hope after months of searching, will be meeting. With the Coastal Preservation Alliance at 2, Dominic reminded him as they deplaned. Their director, Dr. Eleanor Winslow, has assembled local environmental experts to discuss implementation possibilities for the artificial reef monitoring system. Julian nodded absently, his attention drawn to the charming town center visible as they drove from the airport. Port Arbor was everything the name suggested. Historic harbor town where fishing vessels shared dock space with pleasure boats, where Victorian architecture stood proudly against the modern world's encroachment. "I'd like to explore for an hour before the meeting," Julian announced. It's an unusual request that made Dominic blink in surprise. "There's a bookstore I want to visit." This was a half-truth. What had actually caught Julian's attention was a magazine article in the airport lounge featuring Port Arbor's renaissance as an ecotourism destination. A particular photograph had stopped his heart momentarily, a stunning macro image of a rare coastal wildflower, credited to E. Reed, Port Arbor Botanical Archives. The bookstore, Harbor Books and Botanicals, was housed in a converted lighthouse keeper's cottage. Julian browsed methodically until he found the local interest section, where a handsome coffee table book titled Endangered Blooms of the Northwest Coast caught his eye. Yes. He opened it with hands that refused to remain steady, and there it was. On the acknowledgments page, photography by Evelyn Reed, Port Arbor Botanical Archives and Reed's Nursery. "That's one of our best sellers," the bookstore owner commented. "Evelyn's photography has put our little town on the map for botanical enthusiasts. Are you interested in rare plants, Mr. Blackwood?" "Julian Blackwood," he replied, watching carefully for recognition, but seeing none. "And yes, I find preservation of endangered species fascinating. Is Reed's Nursery nearby?" 20 minutes later, Julian stood before a Victorian house with weathered, blue siding and a wraparound porch, overflowing with plants. The sign swinging gently in the sea breeze confirmed he'd found the right place, heart pounding with an anxiety foreign to his normally composed demeanor. He climbed the steps and pushed open the door that triggered a gentle chime. The interior was a masterful chaos of life. Plants of every description thrived in carefully, arranged displays that guided visitors through a botanical journey. Photography lined the walls, exquisite close-ups of flower structures, delicate seedlings emerging from soil, time-lapse sequences of blooms opening. "I'll be right with you," called a familiar voice from the back room. Julian stood frozen as Evelyn emerged, wiping her hands on a garden apron. Hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, cheeks flushed from exertion. She stopped abruptly, color draining from her face as recognition dawned. "Julian," she whispered, his name a question and an answer simultaneously. "You're a difficult woman to find, Evelyn Reed," he said quietly, holding up the book he'd purchased, "though perhaps not impossible if one knows where to look." She glanced nervously toward the back of the shop, then moved closer. "Wildflower," and a quote, he replied.
"Odd."
"And perhaps a certain stubborn unwillingness to believe our meeting was meant to live once, as you put it." Evelyn's expression shifted between wonder and alarm. "You shouldn't be here, Julian. My life is complicated." "I gathered that when you disappeared without a trace," he said, without accusation. "I don't need simple, Evelyn. I just need honest."
Ow.
Elderly voice called from the back room. "Evie? Who's there?" Her eyes held Julian's for one electric moment. "A customer, Grandpa. A customer who's very interested in our preservation work." "Then show him the greenhouse," came the reply. "For heaven's sake, invite him to stay for tea." A smile tugged at the corner of Julian's mouth. I believe I've just been issued an invitation I can't refuse. Evelyn's resistance visibly wavered. 1 hour, she conceded. I can give you 1 hour to explain why you tracked me down. And then you need to leave Port Arbor and forget you found me. But even as she spoke the words, they both recognized the futility of the requests some connections once made. Refused to be severed by time or distance or even the secrets that lay between them. Rooted truths, the greenhouse behind Reed's nursery was a cathedral of glass and greenery, where light filtered through leaves in a dance of shadows and illumination. Evelyn moved through the space with practiced grace, her fingers brushing fern, fronds and orchid blooms with the tenderness one might reserve for old friends. This is where I do most of my conservation work, she explained, leading Julian to a section where seedlings grew in meticulous rows, propagating endangered native species, documenting their growth cycles, creating a seed bank for future restoration projects. Julian observed her in this element, confident, passionate, utterly authentic. You weren't exaggerating about your work that night, he said. If anything, you understated it. A sad smile crossed her features. I've learned to be cautious about what I reveal, especially to people from your world, my world. Of influence, power, headlines. Evelyn turned to face him directly. Why are you really here, Julian? What could possibly justify the resources you must have expended to find me? Instead of answering immediately, Julian reached into his pocket and withdrew the pressed gentian with its accompanying note. Because in 39 years I've never met anyone who made me feel both seen and accepted in the same moment. Because every conversation since that night has felt shallow by comparison. Evelyn's composure faltered as she took the preserved flower with trembling fingers. You kept it. Of course I kept it. It was all you left me. The greenhouse door creaked open as Harold Reed wheeled himself inside, a tray with a teapot and cups balanced precariously on his lap. Thought you two might need refreshments for what sounds like an overdue conversation, he announced without preamble. Grandpa, please, Evelyn began. Don't Grandpa please me, Harold interrupted, positioning himself between them. Mr. Blackwood, I presume? Harold Reed, former botanist, current nosy grandfather, and wholly unimpressed by wealth or status, but very impressed by anyone who makes my granddaughter nervous. Julian found himself smiling despite the tension. A pleasure to meet you, sir. Now, Harold continued, pouring tea with surprising steadiness. Shall we address the elephant in the greenhouse? My son Evelyn's father, Thomas Reed, former financial advisor to some very important people, currently serving year 3 of a 10-year sentence for alleged embezzlement and fraud. Grandpa, Evelyn's voice rose in alarm. He's going to find out eventually, Evie, Harold said gently. Better to know if he runs for the hills now or stays to hear the whole story. Julian accepted the offered teacup. I'm not running anywhere. For the next hour, in the humid warmth of the greenhouse, Evelyn reluctantly shared the story she'd been fleeing. How her father, a respected financial advisor, had been accused of stealing millions from his clients, including several prominent philanthropists who frequented the same charity circuit as Julian. How the evidence seemed irrefutable, despite Thomas Reed's unwavering claims of innocence. How the Reed name had become synonymous with betrayal in certain circles. The night we met, Evelyn concluded, I was filling in as a favor to a friend, who had no idea of my connection to Thomas Reed. When I saw your name on the guest list, I nearly left. Your venture capital firm had investments with several of the victims. I thought I'd recognize your name, Julian realized. Or worse, that you already had and were simply waiting for the right moment to confront me. She set down her cup. When we connected so unexpectedly, I allowed myself one night of pretending the scandal didn't exist. But by morning, I knew I couldn't drag you into it. Old Julian was quiet for a long moment. My father committed suicide when his investment firm collapsed, he finally said, the words emerging with difficulty. He'd been manipulated by his partner into covering increasingly risky positions. When it all fell apart, he couldn't face the investors who'd trusted him. I was 14. Harold and Evelyn exchanged surprised glances. The evidence against your father, Julian continued. Who assembled it? Balecorp Financial Forensics, Harold answered. Why? A shadow crossed Julian's face. Because they're the same firm that cleared my father's partner of wrongdoing. The partner who later admitted to orchestrating the entire fraud after the statute of limitations had expired. Are you suggesting? Evelyn began. I'm suggesting, Julian said carefully, that perhaps your father's claims of innocence deserve a second look. With resources that weren't available 3 years ago, the silence that followed was heavy with implication and fragile hope. Outside, the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, casting long shadows across the greenhouse floor. Why would you help us, Evelyn? Finally asked. You don't even know us? Julian set down his cup and reached across the space between them, his hand open in invitation. Because some connections aren't just meant to echo, Evelyn. Some are meant to grow roots. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his. Harold cleared his throat. Well then, he said with a suspicious brightness in his rheumy eyes. I believe that's my cue to go make dinner for 3 instead of 2. Perennial promise. 6 months later, the same greenhouse hosted a very different gathering. String lights twined among the rafters, casting a warm glow over the assembled group. At the center, Harold Reed sat proudly in his wheelchair, freshly pressed suit contrasting with the lush greenery surrounding him. Beside him stood Thomas Reed, thinner and grayer than in the photographs Julian had seen, but with the same intelligent eyes as his daughter, and the unburdened expression of a man recently exonerated. I never thought I'd see this day, Thomas said, raising a glass in toast. 2 unexpected alliances and the persistence of truth. The small gathering, including Julian's legal team. Investigative journalists who had broken the story of Balecorp's pattern of fabricated evidence, and the judge who had overturned Thomas's conviction raised their glasses in response. And to Julian, Thomas added, his voice thick with emotion, who had no reason to believe in a stranger's innocence, but chose to anyway. Julian, standing slightly apart as was his habit even now, nodded in acknowledgement. His gaze, however, was fixed on the greenhouse entrance, watching for Evelyn's return. She had excused herself moments earlier, uncharacteristically flustered. She's probably in her darkroom, Harold murmured as Julian passed his chair. East wing, down the hall, last door on the left. Julian navigated through the Victorian house that had become familiar territory over the past months. Into Thomas Reed's case had required frequent visits to Port Arbor, each one deepening his connection not just to Evelyn, but to this place and the legacy she was building. He found her in the darkroom as predicted, surrounded by photographs hanging from drying lines. Unlike her usual botanical subjects, these images told the story of the past 6 months, Thomas's release from prison, the press conference announcing Balecorp's multiple instances of evidence tampering, the rebuilding of the Reed family's reputation and business. Your father's speech moved you, Julian observed, careful not to touch any of the drying prints. Evelyn turned, eyes bright with unshed tears. I spent 3 years believing we'd never clear his name, that the best we could hope for was to build a quiet life far from anyone who knew us. And then you walked into our shop and upended everything, for better or worse? Julian asked, the question carrying weight beyond the immediate conversation. Evelyn stepped closer, navigating between the hanging photographs, undeniably better. My father is free. The nursery is thriving with the publicity from the case. Grandpa's health has improved now that his stress levels have decreased. She paused, looking up at him. But there's still one unresolved question, which is, what happens now? Your life is in the city, your company, your foundation, your world. And mine is here with these plants, this community that accepted us when no one else would. Julian considered her words carefully. In the months of working to clear Thomas Reed's name, he discovered something unexpected, a sense of purpose beyond technological innovation and wealth accumulation. The Reed family's struggle had awakened dormant parts of himself, connections, 2 principles his father had valued before tragedy struck. I've been thinking about that, he admitted. About what constitutes a life well lived. I've built companies, made fortunes, changed industries, but until I met you, I hadn't built connections that mattered. Evelyn's breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying that Nexus Innovations has excellent video conferencing technology. Julian replied with uncharacteristic humor, in that Port Arbor happens to be the perfect location for the headquarters of a new conservation technology division focused on botanical preservation systems. You'd relocate part of your company. For this, she gestured vaguely, encompassing the dark room, the nursery beyond, and perhaps herself. For this, Julian confirmed, taking her hands in his. For the chance to build something permanent with you, not just moments that echo, but a future that grows. He hesitated, vulnerable in a way few had ever witnessed. If that's what you want to? Evelyn studied their intertwined hands, his bearing the smooth precision of technological creation, marked with the honest calluses of earth and growth. Different worlds that had collided through chance or fate or perhaps some cosmic design, neither of them fully understood. I spent so long running from connections, she admitted, protecting myself from the pain of what happened to my father, convincing myself that transient beauty was the only kind worth preserving. She looked up, meeting his gaze with newfound certainty. But some things are meant to take root, aren't they? Julian's answer was to draw her closer, sealing their agreement with a kiss that promised not just passion but partnership of commitment. Too nurturing, what had begun as a whispered conversation under moonlight and had grown into something neither had dared to imagine. From the doorway came a familiar harumph. "If you two are quite finished," Harold announced, wheeling himself into view. "Your guests are wondering where tonight's hosts have disappeared to. Your father's about to break into the good brandy, Evelyn." Julian and Evelyn broke apart, laughing with the lightness of shared joy. "We'll be right there, Grandpa," Evelyn promised, as they followed Harold back toward the greenhouse celebration. Julian paused, drawing Evelyn to a stop beside a wall of her framed photography images of rare and resilient species that thrived against improbable odds. "I almost forgot," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I brought something for you." He handed her a small velvet box that, when opened, revealed not jewelry, but a tiny glass vial containing seeds. "Gentiana autumnalis," he explained, as she examined it in wonder. "The same species as the pressed flower you left me. Nearly extinct in the wild, but perhaps with the right care." Evelyn closed her fingers around the precious vial, understanding. "The symbolism, without need for elaboration? Plant them together," she said, "tomorrow at dawn." Outside, the coastal fog began rolling in. But unlike the night they'd met, it didn't obscure or separate. Instead, it enveloped the greenhouse in a gentle embrace, cocooning the gathered celebration in a world apart, a world where second chances took root, where connections persisted beyond a single night, and where love, like the rarest of blooms, flourished in the most unexpected places. Some moments were indeed meant to echo forever, but others, the most precious ones, were meant to grow into something perennial and abiding, nurtured by truth, rooted in forgiveness, and blooming anew with each passing season.